Yo, what is up everybody, it's Jay the Great here and welcome back to another Naruto reaction video here today. And today, once again, we are going down the old archives of the Great Swagkage, and as you told the title, this is Dissecting Orochimaru. So firstly, this was another recommended video by one of you folks, so shout out to you for that. And when it comes to Orochimaru, Orochimaru is simply put a cynical and narcissistic individual that is willing to take any measures necessary to achieve his objective. We see it from the very initiation of the narrative. He's willing to experiment on individuals, including children, to further his knowledge and power. Right? He iterates his ideology, specifically in his altercation with Hiruzen during the Konoha Crush arc, and in the flashbacks that he and Hiruzen have of their history. He says, there's not enough time in a lifespan to achieve true power. That's why I must achieve immortality, and I must acquire more knowledge and tools in my arsenal to become the ultimate shinobi. Right? That's essentially what his goal was. And when we see him, even from his youth in the narrative, he was always a very unique shinobi. Right? And we start to see the progression of his narcissism and cynical nature come into play. We even see it during one of the Great Ninja Wars when Jiraiya was injured, and he says, "Hey, says leave him here." Right? And Tsunade's like, "You're out of your mind. You're out of your mind." Right? That just illuminates the progressing self-destruction of morality in Orochimaru. Right? So I'm actually very interested to see what Swagkage has to say about this one. But before we begin, let's really appreciate, hit that like button, turn on bell notification to stay updated with yours truly. And if you enjoy, man, you mess with the kid, make sure to hit that sub button, because once you become part of the family forever. Let's not waste any more time, screen. Let's see what Swag has to say about this one.
Yo, what's going on, everybody?
What up?
Swagkage here, and welcome to today's video, where we're going to be talking about everybody's favorite pale-skinned snake man, Orochimaru, one of many Naruto characters introduced during the Chunin exams that ended up being a mainstay in the cast up until the end of the series. Though, unlike many of the characters introduced during that arc, Orochimaru was a villain then and has remained a villain to this day. For the most part, anyway. What sets him apart from many of Naruto's other main villains is that Orochimaru is played completely straight. He's an unapologetic bad guy, a terrible person to the core with no redeeming qualities. Now, that by itself isn't enough to make him a unique character. There are plenty of straight villains out there in the vast world of fiction, but in this series in particular, I think it's enough to make Orochimaru feel distinct. That isn't to say that Naruto doesn't have its own fair share of other straight villains, but what sets Orochimaru apart from them is his very apparent complexity. He has a pretty simple goal, and that is to become immortal and master as many jutsu as humanly possible. But what led him to that goal and the way he pursues it is what makes him so interesting. Now, the series doesn't dwell on this too much, but it is stated that Orochimaru lost both of his parents when he was young. He's an orphan. It's sort of implied that the death of his parents hit him pretty hard, as it would any child. And now I believe that having to cope with this led him down a slippery slope, where he began to develop an extreme and unnatural bitterness towards the concept of death and human mortality overall. Now, the death of his parents on its own didn't push him over the edge. Like I said, that was just the push that sent him down the slope in the first place. Orochimaru probably saw plenty of other people die during his time as a shinobi in the Hidden Leaf. He fought in the Second Shinobi World War, after all. And we do know, based on the way Nagato speaks about that war, that it wasn't the most pleasant experience for everybody involved in it. A more direct and concrete example of the effects that this war may have had on Orochimaru is the death of Tsunade's lover Dan, which came shortly after the death of her little brother Nawaki. And as her squad mate, he was right there with her when she had to deal with both of these deaths. They hit Tsunade hard, and by extension I imagine they hit Orochimaru hard, as did many of the other deaths he had to witness while he was fighting as a member of the Leaf's military. Now, I know it is stated that Orochimaru had a pretty twisted and sadistic personality even as a little kid, but I'm pretty sure that his ties with his squad kept him a lot more warm and human than he was when he was first introduced in the Forest of Death. It's made apparent that Jiraiya really cared about this guy, so there was obviously some good buried deep in Orochimaru itself. some point. I think having people he was close to kept his insanity at bay, but eventually, whatever it was keeping him from acting like a maniac was eroded away. I think what caused him to slowly lose his humanity is a combination of what I just mentioned, the fact that he, over time, developed this very strong hatred for the concept of death, particularly due to the effects that it had on other people. But, interestingly, I also think that as Orochimaru slowly began to fear and despise death, he also grew progressively desensitized to it due to how much of it he had to see during the Second Shinobi World War. This also probably wasn't helped by the fact that, like many characters have said, Orochimaru seemed to be a bit of a weirdo from the start, so obviously somebody who hates the idea of mortality and dying more than anything else is going to be driven to attempt to prevent it. And pretty much anybody who knew Orochimaru claims that he was and has always been a genius, so I feel that he was aware that he had the tools at his disposal to, at the very least, start working towards a way to prevent people from dying. Now, over time, I believe that this pretty respectable and reasonable goal of discovering a way to prevent death devolved into a new goal that only involved Orochimaru discovering a way to make himself immortal. And I believe that this happened because of all of the terrible things Orochimaru had to do in his pursuit of this. Like I mentioned earlier, he had already been desensitized to the idea of death by the Second Shinobi World War, and I think that made it significantly easier for him to justify killing other people in the pursuit of finding a permanent cure for human mortality. But this caused him to lose his humanity over time, and eventually turned him into the monster that we know him as when he is first introduced. As his sanity continued to slip away from him, I believe Orochimaru continued further down this slippery slope until he reached a point where he was willing to do absolutely anything if it meant pushing him closer to completing this immortality jutsu. Then he continued even further down this slope until becoming immortal was no longer his only ambition, and he additionally wanted to learn how to master every possible jutsu under the sun. As this began to become a core part of his ambition, Orochimaru felt that it was justified to do all of the things he had been doing in the pursuit of immortality, but for a much more selfish purpose, that being to discover and create new potential jutsu. By the time he reached this point, Orochimaru had already resorted to things like kidnapping, murder, human experimentation, and a bunch of other horrible, cruel acts, all of which had completely devolved him into a shell of the person that he used to be. By the time Hiruzen discovered him performing human experiments in his underground lab, Orochimaru had become a completely different person, a self-serving madman with a god complex and a love for chaos. Between this point and the point at which we first see him during the series, I'm pretty sure he spiraled even further into insanity, as made evident by the fact that he has 4 different hideouts, all filled to the brim with living prisoners that he performs countless experiments on. His enormous ego and out-of-control god complex had also probably reached new heights, considering the fact that he assassinated the 4th Kazekage, Gaara's father Rasa, impersonated him to infiltrate the Chunin exams, and assassinated the 3rd Hokage, Hiruzen Sarutobi, his former master, all because he thought it would be pretty funny. Then of course the way he speaks to and about Naruto makes it very apparent that Orochimaru doesn't really like people without talent, and considers he and prodigies like him above everybody else, or something along those lines, just based on the little speech he gives to Jiraiya during their fight in the 3-way deadlock. Now that's not to say Orochimaru hadn't earned his ego. By early part 1, Orochimaru had mastered all sorts of jutsu, including one of the most powerful kinjutsu in the whole series, the Impure World Reincarnation technique, which he was able to use to summon Hashirama and Tobirama, the guy who created the jutsu.
So I definitely want to get my thoughts halfway through the video here. Now, a common theme that I see with Orochimaru, like I said at the beginning of this video, is narcissism, right? It all comes down to that, because what happens to Orochimaru, like Swag very well said, he experiences this desensitization when it comes to death and suffering of others, right? Now, he is a sort of nihilist, not in the sense that he doesn't care about his own well-being or his own progression as a shinobi or as a living thing, but rather of everything else around him, as long as he could provision for himself and reach his objective. He is nihilistic to everything and everyone else, right? And we see that become more and more apparent as these feelings of narcissism and self-excluding nihilism begin to intensify, right? He becomes more and more cynical and more bitter towards the mortality and idea of death, right? He sees death as weakness. He sees death, and not even just death, but also, and even declinement in ability as disgusting. He sees it as a gross idea and an evolutionary stage that he doesn't want to endure himself, right? Especially when and we see this illuminated upon when he's conversing with Hiruzen. He says, "You've gotten rusty, old man. If you're 10 years younger, you'd actually have a shot. I'm becoming greater, and you're declining. You're withering away. You're this old man who just sits around," right? He's basically talking down upon Hiruzen because he lacks the conviction to obtain long-lasting or eternal power, because that's Orochimaru's goal, right? So with the narcissism comes the nihilism, comes the cynical nature, etc., right? So he despises death, mortality, and weakness, right? He despises these things, and he respects power and wants power. He craves power, which is why Sasuke was a person of interest to him, right? Sasuke, being the brother of Itachi Uchiha, was to him the second best thing that he could obtain, right? Because Itachi was just too powerful for even himself, right? He tried to take Itachi's eyes and take his power, but Itachi quickly humbled him and made him realize, "You'll never be on my level," right? That's basically what he told Orochimaru. So Orochimaru had a traumatic experience that served as a deterrent to ever challenging Itachi again. And he came to the conclusion, hey, Sasuke's the second best thing. He is his brother after all. He has immense potential. He has the Sharingan. I'm going to develop him and take his body to achieve greater power. And then maybe even then, I'll be able to combat Itachi and take his eyes and his arsenal, right? So power is what he craves. Mortality and death is what he avoids, right? So that's essentially Orochimaru in a nutshell. So far, the video is very well done by Swagkage. Let's continue.
In the first place, in order to have them fight his former master as a form of psychological warfare. He went through all of the trouble to bring two of the most powerful shinobi who had ever lived back from the dead, just because he thought it would be funny to see Hiruzen's heart break at the thought of having to fight his two predecessors. The guy was a god among shinobi, who probably had over 1,000 jutsu at his disposal, much like Kakashi, but instead of copying them with the Sharingan the way Kakashi did, Orochimaru managed to learn and create all of these jutsu naturally. This brings me to my next point, which is going to involve discussing his obsession with the Sharingan and the Uchiha clan. Now, despite the fact that Orochimaru was well aware of how talented he was, he knew for a fact that no matter what jutsu he created, he would never be able to replicate the natural phenomenon that was the Sharingan. These eyes gave their owners access to some of the most fearsome abilities in the entire shinobi world, but because they were a Kekkei Genkai, Orochimaru had no way of accessing them. There are a whole lot of reasons why this was a problem for him. Not only was it impossible to access the Sharingan without either being born with them or having them implanted, but furthermore, all but 2 members of the Uchiha clan, to most people's knowledge anyway, had been killed off already. This meant that Orochimaru's only options for retrieving the Sharingan would be either to capture the body of Itachi Uchiha or the body of Sasuke Uchiha, both of whom were considered especially talented even among the universally prodigal members of the Uchiha clan. While Orochimaru could have simply killed Sasuke and implanted his Sharingan himself, or stolen some of the Sharingan from Danzo's collection, I'll use Kakashi as an example once again to explain why that's a bad idea. Orochimaru wanted to be able to use these eyes to their fullest extent, and without an Uchiha body, he wouldn't have been able to do that. Heck, Kakashi couldn't even deactivate the Sharingan, so trying to use these eyes without an Uchiha body provides pretty severe handicaps, and I know a limitation like that for somebody like Orochimaru just wasn't going to fly. This is a guy who always wants more, and I know for a fact that he wouldn't be satisfied settling for a handicapped pair of Sharingan. Because of this, and furthermore because of the fact that capturing Itachi Uchiha's body was completely out of the question, Orochimaru had no choice but to focus on capturing the body of Sasuke Uchiha.
Correct.
Because of how important the Sharingan were to him, as they would allow him to develop new jutsu much more quickly, and acquiring the Sharingan is the first step towards acquiring the Rinnegan, Orochimaru ended up becoming obsessed with capturing Sasuke's body, and as everybody knows, this is what eventually led to his downfall. I think this character arc in particular, one where Orochimaru stubbornly continues used to attempt to acquire the Sharingan for himself, despite the fact that he already had so much, speaks volumes about who he is. He could not stomach the feeling of inferiority towards the Uchiha that his lack of Sharingan created, and like I said, eventually became so obsessed with acquiring a full power pair of Sharingan that he put his life in so much danger that he was nearly killed by Sasuke, and once again nearly killed by Itachi. Admittedly, I do think that he was pushed to a point of desperation by the effects that the Reaper Death Seal had on his body and, well, I guess multiple bodies, but the lengths he went to and the sheer amount of danger he placed himself in. Also, he could acquire a pair of Sharingan thoroughly communicates just how greedy, self-centered, and ambitious Orochimaru truly is. Not to say that I hate him for any of this. All of Orochimaru's flaws, aside from the fact that he's a complete and total psychopath, are pretty human and easy to understand, and I think they make him a far more three-dimensional and interesting character than he would have been without them. Now, a lot of his evil and malice seems to have faded away over the course of the Fourth Shinobi World War and the years that followed it, but I don't really know enough about the person that Orochimaru has become to dedicate another segment to dissecting who he is now. So I think this is where I'm going to go ahead and end the video. If you guys have any questions,
great video by Swag as always.
Below. And if you think I missed anything or want me to address another aspect of his character, then by all means ask me in the comments and I'll do my best to reply there. Anyhow, thanks as always for watching the video all the way to the end. Hope you have a fantastic rest of your day, and until my next video, I'll talk to you later. Swagkage out. Bye.
Alright, there you guys have it. That's the video. I certainly must give my thoughts on this. Very good video by Swag once again. Very good work by him. Very good analysis of the character that Orochimaru is. So, I like the last point that Swag made when it comes to the craving for superiority that Orochimaru has, right? And the Uchiha were this godlike entity to Orochimaru that he wanted to surpass, or at least reiterate, as a shinobi himself, right? So, especially after Itachi's easy victory over him, his ambitions would grow, right? Because he would see the Uchiha and their immense talent and power and say, I don't want to feel beneath them. I don't want that. I need their power to surpass them. I must be the absolute superior in this shinobi world, right? That's what he wanted. That's what he was striving for, which is why he went to these great lengths, right? He was willing to kidnap a child to achieve this, to manipulate a child to achieve this in Sasuke Uchiha, right? So he was willing to hone Sasuke's skills, appear as a mentor to him, and then eventually steal his body, right? That was the goal. But Hiruzen heavily increased the difficulty of that goal by removing his arms with the Reaper Death Seal. Right? His arms are the tools to weave hand signs, to execute jutsu, etc. So without that, he was heavily limited. And that is probably a big reason why he never did steal Sasuke's body. Right? So Hiruzen was a hero in the end. Right? Despite all the criticisms that we have of him for his lack of leadership, he did save Sasuke's life in the long run. Because if Orochimaru had his arms and was not sick, he would have taken Sasuke's body, more than likely. Very likely. And that would have caused a chain reaction to very different events in the narrative, such as Itachi possibly coming after Orochimaru with killer intent. Right? So, many things would have been different. But going back to Orochimaru, again, is a cynical and narcissistic individual that wants to be the absolute superior in the shinobi world. And he's willing to go to any means necessary to achieve that objective. And he's willing to do whatever it takes to do that. He's willing to murder, to torture, to experiment, to risk. Right? He's willing to do all of these things to achieve that power. Now, when it comes to, again, the Uchiha, they have Kekkei Genkai, right? And Kekkei Genkai is something that you're either genetically predisposed to have or not, right? Unless you have an implant such as Kakashi, right? Unless that happens, there's no way for you to achieve and utilize these kinds of powers. So Orochimaru had to resort to kidnapping and attempting to steal bodies, right? You had to find a way to obtain these powers, even if it wasn't in a natural way, right? Because naturally, he did become very powerful regardless. He became Kage level. such a threat that he was relative to Hiruzen in the end. Right, so that is essentially who Orochimaru was. Now, when it comes to current Orochimaru, in the war arc, he certainly had an epiphany. Now, an argument you can make as to why that is maybe with a residue of himself being inside Kabuto, maybe he experienced the Izanami himself. There's no way to objectively confirm nor deny that. It's just simply a theory, but it makes sense rationally and in hindsight, because Kabuto had an epiphany and he came back as a good guy and an ally, right? And it makes sense, and that would explain why Orochimaru did the same, right? Maybe he experienced the Izanami, maybe he was in that loop to some arbitrary extent, and he was reformed, right? Now, you could argue, well, as soon as he came out, he said, I'm not strong enough to take Sasuke's body, but maybe he was being modest. I do think he's inferior to Sasuke. I'm not saying that that's a lie, but I think he might have just said that to not maybe blatantly indicate that he's a good guy now, but simply put, he certainly was reformed, regardless of what you think. And that's a different Orochimaru. The Orochimaru on Boruto is a different person. He has a son in Mitsuki. He seems to care about his son. He sent him to Konoha to receive education and grow bonds with other people, such as Naruto's son and Sasuke's daughter. So Orochimaru surely has reformed himself and has become a different person, right? So that is sort of the evolution of Orochimaru. But to be honest, the intriguing Orochimaru was the earlier iteration of him in Part 1, throughout Part 1. That was the most intriguing version of Orochimaru, and of course in Shippuden as well, to see how ambitious and narcissistic he was, right? How much conviction he had towards this goal of his in achieving absolute superiority, right? So Orochimaru is one of the best villains and antagonists in all of Naruto, especially in Part 1. He certainly is, and many in the fandom agree with that. Many in the fandom agree that he was threatening, he was powerful, he was evil, narcissistic, self-absorbed, and just a straight-up villain. Kishimoto wrote him well. So that's basically my thoughts in the video, folks. Very good video by Swagkage as always. And as always, you let me know your thoughts as well in the comment section below. What do you think of Orochimaru? Do you think we missed something? Do you think we were spot on with him? Do you think we were wrong about him? Whatever the case may be, make sure to leave that in the comment section below, and I'll catch you in the next video. This is Jay the Great signing out. Peace.